imagine to be a series of book projects. This one defends paternalism. The next one will defend sexism. Then I'm going to defend racism, and then homophobia, and then anti-Semitism, and then I'm just going to defend white male privilege. And then I can probably end my career and be happy. But you know, I must say I find myself, and it's only sort of somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because I find myself somewhat ambivalent about my feelings about paternalism. And the reason is because of having now spent a good part of, I don't know, my last 5 or 6 years writing this book on humanitarianism. And at the end of the day, you know, paternalism's a bad word there, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure there's much of an alternative, and I'll tell you why, and I think what are some of the dilemmas here. I begin, though, just simply with a claim or an observation, which is that there exists an international humanitarian order which is dedicated to the protection of suffering, protection of those in immediate peril, and the prevention of unnecessary suffering. And as we think about this international humanitarian order, I want you to imagine not just simply emergency assistance, but also imagine areas of public health, development, human rights. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of now global interventions that are justified in the name that they are going to help alleviate suffering and improve welfare, you know, lead to progress and so forth and so on. And you know, you're familiar with them. They oftentimes have little agency names attached to them as a consequence, and whether they do good or not is always a matter of dispute, but the ideas behind them are some that I think are deeply cherished and are often viewed as a sign of moral progress. We care about refugees, we care about poverty, we care about what happens in the lives of vulnerable populations. The problem, though, and this has been in some ways one of my struggles as I've been writing this book, is that I find myself sort of an in-house critic, a friend, but sympathetic friend of humanitarian action. And that's kind of what that book begins to hint at, is that these moments of care that are generally celebrated are also moments of silencing. And when those who have the capacity to act, who engage in acts of compassion, have oftentimes demonstrated an incredible inability, insensitivity, inability to recognize the genuine needs, hopes, and aspirations of others. So, you know, we jokingly say, "Hi, I'm here to help you," and that's kind of the standard line, which is like, I'll always be worried about those who claim they're here to help. But in fact, broadly speaking, when we look at this kind of ethics of care, from regardless of where our theoretical standpoint is, it's actually more complicated than simply we want to celebrate global institutions of care. Because these global institutions of care are also global institutions of power. And what I want to do is get everybody for the moment just to sort of imagine, if you will, that care and power, care and control are always present with one another. That it's impossible to have care, virtually impossible to have genuine care, without also having genuine control. And the concept that really brought this together for me was paternalism. And it was only rather late in the writing of the book that I began to realize its centrality in terms of my own thinking. But recognize that many global institutions justify various kinds of interventions on the grounds that they know what is best for others. That's true in the human rights field, it's true in the development field, it's true in public health, it's true in emergency relief. To sort of emphasize that, these institutions justify their intervention on the grounds that they actually can act in the best interests of others. In that sense, they are inherently paternalistic. And I'll say why when I get to this definition. But today what I want to do is just simply offer, very briefly, hopefully leaving lots of time for you to yell at me, offer a definition of paternalism that highlights the reasons we give to justify our intervention in the lives of others. And in doing so, I want to just simply punctuate this claim I've already made, that paternalism helps us think about the unstable mixture of care and power that are present in all kinds of international practices. They're just simply part of the deal. Identify the classical reasons for opposing paternalism. So again, go through some of those arguments why paternalism has a bad name, and no one wants to be accused of being a paternalist, and there are good reasons why we don't want to be a paternalist, and there are good reasons why paternalism is seen as a sin. And but also recognize that there are important exceptions. And in fact, liberal political theory has done a pretty good job, especially given its standpoint of privileging autonomy and freedom and voluntary choice, has done a pretty good job of identifying when we should think about exceptions. When should we justify the interference in the lives of others? There are dangers, as liberal political theorists tell us, but there are good reasons for paternalistic behavior. There are good reasons, and it's these good reasons I want to talk about, because I think there are moments when we can defend paternalism. And one of the things that I've been struggling with is really trying to think about, what are those moments? When can we justify paternalism? And when should we worry about its dangers? So rather than simply saying for the moment that all paternalism is bad, I want us to begin with the definition of paternalism and begin at that point conceptually, then to use that to empirically recognize the extent to which this international humanitarian order is deeply paternalistic, and there may be good reasons for it. Okay, so that's my, that's what I'm going to try and do by running over these hot coals. Hopefully I'm not going to get burned, I don't know, but that's kind of what I want to try and do. Now, paternalism has a bad name, as you know, because of very good reasons, which is these are the classic images of 19th century paternalism, whether it's the Jesuits and the White Fathers, or whether it's other kinds of British colonial missionaries, that the presumption is, and this is in many ways then a classic, is that you have the Jesuit priest standing over all the not-so-happy faces of local and often and some foreign children in an educational facility, probably giving them good religious instruction along with modern tools of reading and writing. But I'm not sure paternalism is gone. I mean, we now sort of recoil at these images, but again, I want to suggest is that not all paternalism is necessarily evil. In fact, this is when I did the Google image search for paternalism, that was the first thing that came up. So I figured I had to put it up there because this kind of captures oftentimes I think our deep ambivalence. That's Bono.
With his mouth open, I see.
He's singing, I think.
Oh, he's singing to the
yeah, I don't know what he's doing.
No wonder the kid looks at that.
I don't know what Bono's doing, but Bono probably represents for many of us. On the one hand, here's a rock star who, a white rock star who's going to actually help the poor, struggling masses in Africa, and it's easy to, as I found from my Google image search, to disparage it as an act of paternalism, and again, I don't know what he's doing here. But at the same time, though, you thank God that someone like Bono is actually spending his time doing this. This is actually probably a good thing, because if he wasn't doing it, I'm not sure who else would. And overall, I think the kinds of things he's been pushing for, this is a normative judgment, things like debt forgiveness, are not so bad. And so, but according to Google image search, this is the first thing you'll come, or one of the first things you'll come across when you come to paternalism, which I think actually captures, I think, a lot of the ambivalences that we feel about the continued efforts by the global North to help those in the global South. Now, on to definitions. Lots of definitions to choose from. This is the one that, for all intents and purposes, works for me. I mean, you can spend, as legal scholars do, and bioethicists and medical ethicists and philosophers can spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's the best definition of paternalism. In many ways, these are purpose-built. You choose definitions because they serve what you want. This is the definition that works for me. The interference with a person's liberty of action justified by reasons referring exclusively to the welfare, good, happiest needs, interests, or values of the person being coerced. Now, just before I get to sort of two defining elements, recognize the extent to which power is deeply embedded in this moment, the person being coerced. There's always this question about what's coercion and how, what's the evidence of coercion? Does it have to be physical or emotional or, informal or informal? But there is a sense that the person is not being given the space to really choose. What are the defining features and what makes paternalism different from, just simply naked acts of power and imperialism and colonialism or any other kind of relationship of domination? Well, one is it's an assertion of power over others on the grounds that it is in their best interests. And as the father of 2 teenage girls, I deeply understand this now in ways I never did. Is that and I wish they would let me be more paternalistic, but I'm constantly trying to assert my power on the grounds that I think I know is better. The problem, though, is that I've got these teenage girls that grew up believing that their opinion counts. And so this goes to the separate issue, which is that paternalism operates on the grounds that explicit consent is not necessary to justify the act of imposition. So I have in my head, I sort of like this old father's knows best, where I get to just say, because I'm the father, that's why, and you just do it. And it just never seems to work. But in my, I would love that day for that to happen. But the presumption is then that I can just say what they want, and they don't have to necessarily be involved in the decision. They don't have to provide implied consent, there's no wink and nod, there's no explicit consent. But these two elements together, I'm here to help you, and that's the end of the story, is in many ways the hallmark of what counts as paternalism. Now, there are really good reasons why we condemn paternalism, and the original set of political theoretical arguments against paternalism comes from John Stuart Mill, the patron saint of liberalism, writing in the early 19th century. And in the book on liberty, which is one of the classic treatises of liberty and freedom, writes, the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection, that the only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. In other words, if you do something that creates a negative externality, that's my little economic language, thank you, then we can get involved. But if what you're doing is only a harm to yourself, then, God bless you. You make your own decisions. Why do we say this? Oh, there are lots of reasons. Autonomy and liberty are essential to human dignity. No one can know better than us what we want, and we can never know what is best for others. Even if individuals act in ways that appear irrational or demonstrating poor judgment, to stop them from acting in ways that they believe are consistent with their interests violates their autonomy and dignity. It denies them the opportunity to learn from their mistakes. Nor can paternalism be defended on the grounds that interference improves the welfare of the individual, because ends do not justify means. Paternalism oftentimes is demeaning. It presumes that the individual is incompetent or inferior. It's infantilizing in that respect. Although an actor might give reasons of benevolence, again, I'm here to help you, the powerful are always deluded by the belief that they know what is best for everyone. We should always be worried when actors become convinced of their benevolence and their goodness. And the history of international paternalism, in terms of colonialism, imperialism, and other kinds of missions of goodness, demonstrate the extent to which believing that you really are acting in the best interests of others can be self-medicating. European powers were so enlightened and cared so much about the colonial peoples that they convinced themselves that colonialism was a good thing. And so there are good reasons why that language of paternalism, both historically and theoretically, makes us uncomfortable. No one wants to be called a paternalist. I've asked people in the international organizational community, do you want to be a paternalist? And they're just like, no. Why would I want to be called a paternalist? So please don't do that to me. Then again, exceptions can be made, and John Stuart Mill hinted at that with negative externalities, is that our actions at times might harm others, and so we justify oftentimes government regulation, government intervention in a host of areas that restrict our movements in various ways on the grounds that doing so is important for the health and well-being of others. So, and the other argument here, oftentimes in democratic setting, is that there's been a collective will that there should be some kinds of restraints placed on our individual actors, on our individual behavior. No smoking laws are the classic example of secondhand smoke, and as a consequence, then your right to smoke does not mean that I have a right to have cancer, and therefore we're going to restrict where you can smoke. Safe belt laws, helmet laws. There's a whole bunch of laws that are on the books that are basically justified on the grounds that restricting a person's individual liberty is good for collective welfare and can be justified on those grounds. There are other justifications, though, for paternalism that really concern questions of competence. And this is where it becomes, I think, really interesting, at least for those who, like myself, in international relations. Most arguments in favor of limiting the choice of another for her best interest revolves around the claim of limited capacity or competence. In other words, the person is cognitively, emotionally, or intellectually limited in a way that precludes their ability to make the right decisions. We don't always know what's in our best interests. Some people may have a better idea of what the right priorities are. We don't know how to achieve what we want. My children, if I would have let them, would constantly be on Facebook, which is why I get involved and say, get off Facebook. And they tell me I'm being a paternalist, and I say, that's right, and that's okay. Let me justify my reasons. So there may be, in fact, various arguments in favor of paternalism that exist, and again, the classic arguments are oftentimes parent-child, and I recognize the gendered language here. I'm talking about paternalism and not maternalism, although I'm not really sure that there's oftentimes a lot of difference. Anybody who's ever had mothers understands what I'm talking about in terms of people who care too much. But here we have, in this context, though, various kinds of justifications, and competence is key. I'm going to get to this in a second. Mill, who I just noted, wrote very strongly against any grounds of interference in our individual choice, also noted that there were two categories of individuals, people, who were exceptions to this rule. The first were children, on the assumption that children were not yet competent because they were not just simply little adults. They were cognitively inferior and probably could not make the right decisions until they've reached a certain age. In this country now, we decide 18 is the age of competence, where you can actually make a decision about what you want to do with your life, your body, and so on. Until that time, I'm supposed to, at least with my daughters, supposed to have control, some kind of authority over them, and if I don't exercise proper authority, then the courts would take over, I suppose. And that's always been my fail-safe. Do you want the courts to come in and help you with this one? The other category that Mill talked about were barbarians, by which he basically meant those in the global south. So the argument about why it is that you could actually justify forms of colonialism was that you were acting as a public trustee, that they were not quite competent, they were not quite educated, civilized, mannered, oftentimes for many people it's Christian, and as a consequence, until they're competent, we have a duty. We have a duty to help them until they learn how to help themselves. There is, though, and this is the part I probably spend too much time on just because I think it's fun, is that there's also an argument in favor of paternalism, closely associated with Barack Obama, by the way, which I'll get to, which is coming from a branch of behavioral economics that's concerned with judgment and decision making. Now, as you know, you'll correct me if I get something wrong here, okay? Traditionally, microeconomics and welfare economics contain fairly restrictive assumptions, including the claim that individuals have stable and coherent preferences, and that their choices largely reflect these already existing preferences. Accordingly, many who come from this classical liberal economic tradition take a fairly strong line against all forms of paternalism, arguing that there's no justification for one person to violate the autonomy of another. But what if preferences are unstable? Or there are factors that break that connection between our preferences and our choices? Psychology, experimental economics, and behavioral economics have provided considerable empirical evidence that individuals don't make choices as textbooks portray. There are various factors that can lead to impaired choice. Preferences over options can be shaped by framing. Preferences can be affected by our psychological state at the moments they're expressed. They may be affected by irrelevant information, and they may be expressed differently if experts have a chance to present the information. These are the kinds of arguments that in fact win people Nobel Prizes. People like Tversky and Kahneman, because this is the kind of argument about questions of judgment that revolutionized economics over the last decade and a half. If this is right, then the question is not whether there are factors that interfere with an actor's choice. In other words, that liberal presumption is that there should be no interference with a person's choice. They begin with the fact that there's always external factors that are interfering with choice. And as a consequence, the issue is which third parties should be allowed to influence choice, and could those third parties potentially make choices that are better for us or lead to enhanced collective welfare outcomes? Well, this is, are you familiar with this book?
Yeah.
Okay, so Kat Sunstein is actually now, he just went through the confirmation process. He's now...
Sean Hannity didn't like it very much, but he did make it.
He did make it, okay. I forget, but what job does he have? I forget what job it is. He's a close, he and Obama were colleagues at Chicago in the law school, and Thaler is an economist at the University of Chicago. And they wrote this book called Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, which was, I think, a New York Times bestseller, wasn't it? Which basically makes an argument for the role of government in nudging us in the right direction. They write in the piece that actually provides the sort of rhetorical bedrock for their book. They argue in favor of liberal paternalism. And this is not meant to be an oxymoron, okay? This is supposedly paternalism with a liberal heart. And what does that mean? It means the claim that it is legitimate for private and public institutions to attempt to influence people's choices and preferences even when third-party effects are absent. In other words, we argue for self-conscious efforts by private and public institutions. I'm sorry, now I'm repeating. Our understanding of policy therefore counts as paternalistic if it attempts, doesn't necessarily do it, attempts to influence the choices of affected parties in ways that will make the choosers better off. And they give lots of examples in terms of, let's say, pension plans and how you can structure individual choices in ways that if you have default options one way or another, it will affect rates of savings. And they argue that, in fact, we should structure whether you can opt in or opt out, and I'm sure they'll do this in terms of healthcare as well, opt in and opt out in terms of different kinds of insurance plans, and knowing that how you ranked it and sort of what you do will affect outcomes. And the presumption is then that these planners should structure the choices in ways that is more likely to get us to choose those options that are not only good for us, but good for everybody. So getting people to choose the right public health policy or right insurance plan is good for me and good for society. And so this is their argument, and then they draw a lot from experimental economics to demonstrate the importance of these kinds of external influences that can get us to do the right thing in their judgment.
What are third-party effects in that quote?
Third-party effects would be, for instance, a University of Chicago might, for instance, and this is one of the arguments they give, might decide that, for instance, in terms of rather than giving you a chance to opt in or opt out, whether, for instance, the default option is that you're not opted into the savings plan, and then they would change the default option so that you are defaulted to opt in, and therefore you have to act to opt out. And so it still gives you the preference of choice, but what they show is that, for instance, at the University of Chicago, if you can actually structure the choice so that the default option is now you're in unless you choose otherwise. In fact, I forget what the changes were.
Huge. It's,
You know,
I know it's
very.
yeah, and so it's, you know, it's these kinds of things that they're trying to get you to think about. And
The public option.
yeah, like the public option, which I still don't know what
Yeah, I
it
think
means.
that's a little different.
That's an issue. So anyway, there are, this is sort of the old style, I'll get back to this in a second, of competence. You know, there are lots of, I hope at this point, you're kind of now not ready to kill me, but you're now ready to say, you know, maybe there's grounds for paternalism. And part of it depends, I don't know if I got these slides in, okay. Part of it depends, this is where the slides didn't come in. My daughter did the PowerPoint presentation and it was past her bedtime and then I was left on my own and that's when everything went crazy. Is that, when are we ready to defend paternalism? When are we ready to say that there may be good justifications for violating someone's liberty or not giving them the right to consent? And what would those moments be? So, some questions, if we go back to Gerald Dworkin's definition. The interference with a person's liberty of action justified by reasons exclusively to their welfare. Several questions come up then in this context. The nice thing about liberal paternalism is that it provides a kind of gentle hand. It uses our deep insights from experimental economics to manipulate us in ways that are presumably consistent with what we should be doing anyway. But how much force is justified? The liberal paternalism is nice because it's the gentle hand, but when does the heavy hand justified? And there are lots of times where, in fact, people are not given consent. You're forced to be removed from your houses during disasters. There are other times where you're not given consent in which force can be applied, especially if you're seen as not competent. Scope is also important. What are the range of outcomes and actions that are subject to oversight? One of the interesting things, and I'll give an example, is the extent to which, over time, for instance, with my children, you essentially give them more competence and more autonomy over more things, with the presumption that they're getting older, and as a consequence, are more entitled to make more decisions that affect their lives. Reasons. What legitimating discourse is used, and is such discourse subject to empirical challenge? And in this context, I've been struck by, in my work on humanitarianism, the difference in language between 19th century and 21st century paternalism. Because 19th century missionaries and paternalists came basically with the Bible on their hip belt. They basically argued in reference to God. And the nice thing about references to God is that they're unfalsifiable. You can't really challenge it. If it's the Word of God, it basically becomes a matter of interpretation. There is no way to, unless you want to get into deep philosophical questions about does God exist and what's the real word. By and large, though, those who come armed with biblical prophecy or with religious doctrine tend not to be able, you can't reason with them in the same ways that if, for instance, you come armed with expert information. And one of the interesting things about late 20th and early 21st century paternalism is the extent to which it's the rule by the experts. I'm the expert, I've got the degrees, this is why you come to Humphrey. I've got the training, I can now go and do things that benefit the public good. But the nice thing about having, in reference to, let's say, data, is that you can challenge it in ways that you can't challenge it if the arguments are coming from on high. These are not, at this point I've sort of spent a lot of time on the sort of conceptual apparatus, but in the work I've done on humanitarianism, on peacekeeping and peace building, they are incredibly important and germane. Let's take peace building. Most post-conflict operations go in not with the presumption they want to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. They go in with the presumption that they want to make things better. The question then becomes, whose definition of better? There are arguments now that are fairly well established that talk about liberal peace building, which is the presumption is that these are countries that should be moving towards democracy, markets, rule of law, human rights, and we might all agree on that, but we've agreed on it. How much force can be justified? You know, maybe early on in operations you want to be able to justify the use of force, fairly heavy-handed, and you know, one of the things that you may say is that we can actually accept a liberal paternalism here in this society because of a particular kind of liberal culture that now exists. How much scope, how much range, how involved are we going to allow local people to be involved in the decision making? One of the unstated claims of peace-building operations is that at the outset, the head of the operation gets to act like the pro-council. And this was Patty Ashdown's big thing in Bosnia, was that he was going to make decisions for the Bosnians and the Serbs because he was able to overcome sectarian differences. He could see the collective will in ways that they would not be able to. And there are lots of good reasons why, in fact, we're probably maybe happy that Patty Ashdown said, I've got the authority and I can do this. Over time, though, as the operation proceeds, the presumption, though, is that peace builders are turning more and more tasks over to the local population on the grounds that they are more competent. So one of the big debates, as you can well imagine, in a lot of the areas I study, including, again, peace building and humanitarian action, is this question of the tension between the global and the local. Where oftentimes there's a global vision about what a better society should look like. We want rule of law, we want gender empowerment. There are lots of things that we want that are written into our mandates that we should be providing. But it's not necessarily, and it may be consistent with the preferences of local populations, but it's not as if anybody's ever stopped to ask. Very rarely do they ask. And so in that sense, the fact that they don't ask, and the fact that and as a consequence, peace builders oftentimes don't operate with consent, means that they are operating in a paternalistic mindset. When are we most willing, and here are some of the questions, and so when are we most willing to allow for these stronger versions of paternalism? When bodily harm is at stake, when lives are at stake, when we believe that actors aren't competent to make decisions. Again, going back to the peace-building argument, the implicit claim of trusteeship is a claim about competence. The de facto claim about transitional administrations is a de facto claim about competence. The function of these peace-building operations is to actually build up the competence. In a lot of the documents you see, they talk about capacity building. What does capacity building mean in another version? Creating competent actors on the ground. Well, let me just conclude by talking about some of the things that I've been wondering about, and then this is sort of and I'll tell you what I'd like from you, since this is actually should be about my needs and not yours, is the exactly, and I can justify that action. Okay, is when are we going to justify paternalism, even if we don't want to call it that? And the reason why I want to say is sort of let's not think about a world with or without paternalism, is I think all caring relationships either have or have tendencies towards paternalism. The only time I've seen actually very strong arguments made in an anti-paternalistic way in the global north are frankly by those who I've seen from the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Because they've been the ones, like Jean Kirkpatrick, I've got this great paper written by her years ago, in which she argues, against paternalism. And I think...
She was a Democrat.
Well...
No.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Okay, but, so she argues against paternalism and that the third world should be allowed to do what they want. which was for her, I think, and the reason why the argument was so popular in her circles was it became a way of saying, you know what, we have no obligations to the rest of the world. So I don't want to say that the opposite of paternalism is indifference, but I know that a lot of people who make the anti-paternalistic argument are also a lot of folks who don't want to get involved. That's one. If we're willing to accept that paternalism then is allowed under certain kinds of conditions, when? What would be those conditions? Maybe it's the case, and here's the other normative argument that is, I think, perhaps slightly heretical, is paternalism may be the only way to moral progress. Richard Rorty, who's a very famous, recently passed away, but very famous in terms of a lot of his, what was seen as relativistic leanings, basically argue that if you really want moral progress, you don't wait for it to bubble up from the ground. That most of our great campaigns of moral progress, whether it was anti-slavery or human rights or development, have not come from the peasants. And he would just point to Kampuchea and other places where you've had peasant revolutions. He'd say they're coming from the top. And these have been inherently paternalistic endeavors. So if you really want moral progress, you're going to have to accept a degree of paternalism. He writes, we want moral progress to burst up from below rather than waiting patiently for condescension at the top. So this becomes then, one of the other questions that comes is, how is competence assessed and determined? And who assesses competence? One of my longtime friends and colleagues in Geneva is a fellow by the name of Keith Krause, he runs a small NGO called the Small Arms Survey, but has also been deeply involved in peace-building exercises. And we've talked about doing, because he's interested in peace building, but the big question for him oftentimes in these exercises, who gets to decide who's competent? So when you're looking for institutional partners, you're making decisions about who you think is a legitimate partner. And you have to pick and choose. What criteria do you use? I gave a seminar at the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria on this. And they were saying, we talk about partnership as being part of our core. But gosh, we just can't partner with anybody. And then they'll say we're getting too big, we've got too much money, we've got accountants that are breathing down our necks that want the right reports. That means we've got to go in and train people to do the kinds of things we want them to do. Well, they say, we know what this means. We're coming in heavy-handed. And we're saying this is good for you because it'll help get you money. But they say, but we're deeply uneasy. And then the other big question, lots of questions here, is how do we try and actually contain the dangers of paternalism? There's now this great language out there in the policy community. Stakeholders, local knowledge, partnership, collaboration. This is great, but I cannot find, at least in the humanitarian aid world, I can't find a single instance in which this is partnership that's been anything more than formulaic, where essentially most of the control still resides with those who come from the north and have the money. There may be good reasons for it, as my friends at the Global Fund began to talk about, in terms of they need to know where the money is coming from if they're going to get more money, or how the money is spent if they're going to get more money. But there also may be other kinds of cultural biases as well. And so how is it that we are able to make sure that whatever paternalism does exist and can be justified is limited and contained? Anyway, so these are all sort of big questions that I've been struggling with over the last year that really are about paternalism. And I developed these ideas in the context of the work I was doing on humanitarian action. But the more I got into it, the more I realized the extent to which these issues were not limited to humanitarianism, that they in fact were more generic to our international humanitarian order. So let me close there, and I need help. I need to make sure I don't commit professional suicide. And I also want to make this empirically tractable. I'm interested in sort of what would be the kinds of questions you would ask, what would policymakers want to know in order to make this actually a worthwhile project. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Let's have some comments and questions. Right?
You sure?
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Michael. This is provocative as usual, and when I heard that the title was Paternalism, I thought I should show up.
And stop me before I did something really stupid.
I just come from China, as Sherry knows, where I gave several lectures on the evolution of development thought from the Marshall Plan forward. And if you look at development thought as articulated by the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD or various writers like Nancy Birdsall, Danny Roderick, or whatever, you will see that there is a very strong anti-paternalism movement toward, as you just suggested, cooperation, partnership, or whatever. And in fact, I think there's even empirical studies that demonstrate that to the extent that you can allow the local population to make its own decisions and to agree on what results they want to achieve, the chances are greater in terms of achieving results. The problem is that everyone who works on development finds themselves within a system, an accountability system because they're using someone else's taxpayers' money, or an earmark system that tells them how to spend the money based on what they say in the capitals is the best way to spend the money. And so they're not really allowed to pursue development in the way the professionals have and the scholars have determined it should be pursued. So they're sort of tied, and there's also a terrible international schizophrenia on the issue in the sense that while there may be pure thought within the development community, which of course any development ministry or agency within a within any Western government has a lot less power than the Treasury or Finance Department or the Foreign Ministry or the State Department. And so they're not able to pursue development in the way they think is best. We now have a struggle going on within the U.S. government over this issue, whether the State Department should, control how development is done or whatever. So, accountability is a major issue, and I think you will find that there's certainly a lot of scholarship on the need to move away from paternalism in the way you defined it, even the liberal paternalism. On peace building and peacekeeping, we said on the use of force, how much is justified. The Brahimi panel, of which I was a member, said enough to deter the lingering forces of war. And of course, this issue of paternalism, when it comes to a post-conflict situation, you could ask the question as to whether those to whom you're acting in a paternalistic way want you to act that way because they have lost the capacity within their society to hold it together. And it seems to me that in a peace-building, peacekeeping context, as long as you're on a path away from paternalism, then you're probably justified in what you're doing. The other issue is, take a refugee camp. You need order and discipline in a refugee camp. In some refugee camps, you have people that were formerly Interahamwe, and the Rwanda context, you have bad elements. And yet one of the things UNHCR can't do, even though they do everything else that a city would do to run a refugee camp, they usually don't have a police force. And so they allow the locals from the villages to organize themselves and to keep the security of the camp. And that's a paternalism from within that is very dangerous, and that was proven to be in the case of the Congo with the Rwanda refugees. Anyway, those are comments.
Yeah. Mike, say, respond to that. Yeah, no, the last comment reminded me of several years ago when I was at UNHCR. I had a conversation with someone who was Ogata's chief of staff, and he had been in the Congo in Zaire in '97, and they had a very difficult decision to make because at that point a lot of the Hutu refugees were fleeing deep into the Congo jungle, and part of their Bible, part of their fundamental principle is voluntary repatriation. They don't do forcible repatriation. But they were faced with a very, very difficult choice, which was if they allowed the refugees to keep fleeing into the jungle, they kind of had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen. At the same time, if they forcibly repatriated them to Rwanda, against their will, they also had to worry about retribution, about what their lives would be like in a post-genocidal society, given the accusations, and they have to make a decision. And either one is playing God. And I wouldn't for a moment, they made the decision of forcibly repatriate and take as many as they could. And, that was probably, from where I stand, not involved, probably the right decision, but I wouldn't want that. But that's their position. They have that opportunity. And so it's, on the lingering forces of war, I guess it depends on, one of the interesting questions is how lingering.
Based on good analysis of what you think the threat is.
What you think the threat is, or what the...
If you put a UN force into a country that can't defend itself, let alone the other people in that society, then you shouldn't put anyone in.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But what happens, though, as you move into the post-conflict setting, and let's say, and I've seen analyses that say the problem for the continued violence may be lack of gender equality. And so one of the things we need to be able to do is actually promote grassroots. Secretary of State Clinton just came back from Africa, in which she celebrated grassroots women's organizations and insisted on the role that the outside community would play in giving them a place at the table. And we can look at that and say, yeah, we're happy with that. But that may be seen as, it may be consistent with the preferences of those on the ground. It may be consistent with a minority view of the preferences of those on the ground. It may be consistent with the majority view, but oftentimes we don't know. But we are assuming that this is actually a good thing because it's consistent with, there was a very interesting case a few months ago in which there was a local regional federation in northern Afghanistan that was able to broker a deal with Karzai in terms of regional autonomy. And so their first thing they did when they said we have regional autonomy, we want to actually make sure that we have a cultural integrity, is that women will no longer be allowed to vote. And the aid community went, understandably went nuts. Why are they pouring billions of dollars into Afghanistan to maintain what they understand to be an incredibly repressive, sexist political system? And so they argued for conditionality. They basically said, if you deny women the right to vote, you will no longer get the money. And the local tribesmen said, what you're doing is asserting your values over our cultural traditions. And so one of the things I was sort of wrestled with, so how do we make sense of that? And if I'm the good anti-paternalist, would I then say, oh, I can't get involved? Because I want to say I want to get involved. And I think one of the interesting things that the theorists would help us figure out here is the fundamental question of, did the women themselves have a say in that decision? Who made that decision? Who were the keepers of the cultural heritage?
And even if women did support the decision, you can easily move the argument to the next level. Would they have supported the decision had they had more opportunity to consider their situation in society and the world? And so
yeah,
so it's a situation of competing paternalisms.
Well, maybe or that's right. We have laws that say you cannot sell yourself into slavery.
Right.
Right. So there are laws that tell us that. So there are ways in which to work this around. I mean, one last point, and then I think the point about sort of the attempt of development to move away, and I think that's right. Very conscious of it, but it is the case though that people who get an advanced degree in economics at Harvard, Minnesota, Chicago, like to think it was for something, that they've got some information that gives them some expertise over how development should be run. And one of the interesting things is that they do a lot of, I've seen in the A community, a lot of local needs assessments. And then one of the big questions is what happens when their needs assessments don't really match up with what we really believe they should do for long-term development. And so there are these, it's an interesting set of debates, and part of what I want to try and do is, in many ways, have policymakers really wrestle with this and think about what that means.
I think this is going to be a good book.
Well, thanks for coming today, first of all. And this is just a comment that, you've talked a lot about the motivation for involvement, humanitarian situations or peace building, whatever. You talked a lot about the involvement, but we haven't talked very much about the effect of the involvement.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if maybe it's not so much that people object to paternalism as it is people object to the, like botched or misguided or ill-informed paternalism that's poorly researched and poorly executed. So, and I'm not very familiar with this topic, so I'm not sure the time period in which criticism of paternalism emerged. I would imagine it was around the 70s or 80s, perhaps coinciding with the failure of various structural adjustment programs when, these paternalistic large financial institutions were like imposing projects that were doing exactly the thing you just said, not addressing the needs of communities. So I wonder if maybe instead of focusing on whether paternalism is good or bad, because I think you make a good point that that's not really the issue, maybe we make it more a question of how to improve the execution of these admittedly paternalistic endeavors.
In other words, are the paternalists competent?
Right.
And I think
right.
I have to say that's one of the things that really does worry me in a lot of these arguments, because I tell my daughters I know what I'm doing, but this is all seat of the pants parenting. I have no idea what I'm doing from one day to the next, and they've kind of figured that out. But in the peace building operations as well, and especially those that sort of have the veneer of state building, do we really know what we're doing? I mean, this becomes the argument for local autonomy, right? Is that we really don't know what we're doing, and so therefore we need to delegate and involve local participation as much as possible. But I think you're right that this becomes a real issue, and maybe, and you're right that I wouldn't mind being paternalized if I thought you knew what you were doing. Mm-hmm. But to be basically paternalized by someone who's incompetent is a double insult, and that's and that's why I say one of the interesting questions is who gets to decide who's competent, and it's a
Well, and just to continue that, I mean, we could look at two different projects, two sides of the spectrum. On one hand, we have microfinance. It's just like celebrated, obviously with its flaws, but highly celebrated as a development model that's facilitated by, at times, Western agencies. And then you have something like abstinence-only sex education, which just, really bypass the needs of communities and, in fact, worsen the situation in lots of places, in my opinion. So I think, both of those are Western, norms that are being opposed, but you could say, well, one has gone over quite well, while the other one didn't at all.
Sure.
This may be predictable coming from a history department. In a way, I mean, I see this wonderful set of issues, but I'm still confused as to the problem. It seems to me that when you showed the powerful slide of the Jesuit priest, we could say something that this was a paternalist situation because it was profoundly immoral, racist. It was based on all sorts of false scientific false science, racist assumptions. We have a huge, clear picture of all the ways that a kind of injustice, wrong situation was being perpetuated. Fast forward to 2009 and discussions about Bosnia or certain places in Africa, and the word paternalism is used to refuse somebody. It seems like an utterly different set of concerns. It seems like that the argument of paternalism needs to be totally seen in terms of its being embedded in this context of resources, power, finance, ego, all those sorts of sort of the dense networks of micro issues at any given place. And so now there's a rhetoric, that word paternalist is embedded in a rhetoric that is very different from its origin. And hence I want to ask, is the word governance somehow very relevant here? Why don't we see this as these situations as dilemmas of governance, in which we assume a kind of positive care, concern, value, and we're just fighting over the ways that they're sort of realized, the avenues by which they're made concrete, the strategies of governance, in other words. So I'm not certain that the whole big historical theoretical problem is. I just don't see it's not clear.
Yeah. Let me try and it's a great question. Let me try and answer it in the way that sort of the way I came around to this concept of paternalism was not by sitting back and reading John Stuart Mill, right? It really was going through 200 plus years of history of humanitarianism. And what's interesting, and I think this is actually quite on point of what you said, is that it used to be paternalism was not necessarily a bad word. That in fact you could be a paternalist in the 19th century and say I'm a paternalist, and it was not necessarily.
Anti-slavery.
Yeah, it was an okay thing to be a paternalist in some contexts. And you're right. Now that because of the way we understand paternalism as a concept and as a set of practices, it's now sort of viewed as reprehensible. And so the question that you raise is, as in terms of analysis, is that, I basically have argued that this is a concept in analysis. That what I've done is taken this concept of paternalism and said, what are its, how is it defined, and how can we use that concept to think about a variety of historical situations. And the reason why I would sort of justify using it in this context is because I have not found another word that really captures that tension between care and control.
Governance.
Well, but governance is a loaded term in the sense that there's a lot of governance literature that, at least I've tracked, let's say the global governance literature, which I know best, which is in fact very much based on notions of voluntary consent. Very much notions about a procedural legitimacy that oftentimes doesn't exist here. But you're right that there may be some forms of governance, but at least in the terms of global governance stuff I've seen, in some ways I'd almost position this argument against the global governance argument, in part because a lot of the global governance does sort of suggest this kind of grassroots, anti-state, sort of more liberal veneer.
I mean, doesn't paternalism suggest intent in a way that governance really does?
Yeah, but I would hesitate. I mean, for me, governance is all about power and the negotiation of the consent and planting seeds of. I mean, the Foucauldian idea is that you're led to self-governance. And so
Right.
there's this spectrum of control that the line between autonomy and institutions are quite fuzzy and gray, and they're enacted. Always enacted. Use the phrase. This is my last comment. The rule of experts. Do you know the Timothy Mitchell book?
Yeah,
Rule of experts.
yeah.
Okay.
That's why I stole the phrase. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No. Just one last on that. Foucault in one of his last lectures talks about pastoral power.
Yeah.
And that sort of that one moment in which, and so I think in some ways it's kind of like that, in which you're trying to lead them to competence and self-rule. And so I think there are those elements here that are present. But the other thing, though, just one last point, because I've been really trying to wrestle with this, is we think about these sort of what discourses justify. If we think for a moment what discourses justify our intervention in the lives of others without their consent, and I just simply don't even mention the word paternalism, then we would say, okay, 19th century God, religion, and so forth. 21st century experts, and so it's still there. But then the question is it make it easier for us to control it? So that's.
Yeah, I wonder where collaboration fits in all of this. I mean, I thought about this on a smaller scale. I worked years ago, thank you, okay, for a development assistance organization that at the time was using surplus commodities that people locally had no taste for, had no experience with, and we had a whole imposed nutrition education structure and so on. I've seen CARE, which was the organization, move away from that in years afterwards, correctly I think, into trying to train local nutritionists, into trying to have partnerships with local entities to talk about what sorts of things were palatable and so, culturally acceptable and so on, but all in partnership in a way that formerly was more paternalistic. So that's the question, where is partnership and collaboration in this?
Well, I think it's very present. I wouldn't necessarily call it necessarily paternalistic in the sense that, and this gets into the, you know, as my friends who do political theory will tell me, it gets into the tricky notion of questions of what's consent. But I'm ready to assume that in a lot of those contexts, that those local partners are there because they want to be. That there really is a kind of, I want to be here, I want to learn, in the same way that I go to school not out of coercion, but because I want to learn and I want to be persuaded about a better way to do things. And I think in a lot of these situations, I don't want to necessarily call it, although there may be, at those moments, elements of paternalism as a orientation, in which you talk about the doctor with the bad bedside manner, in which they come in with the kind of know-it-all attitude. So there can be paternalism as a sort of a personality feature, but I'm not sure that just because they're there necessarily makes it paternalistic. And
I wasn't suggesting that. Did it sound that way?
No, not at all. No, for me, an issue that, but so for me, it's part of like, how do I know when paternalism does or doesn't exist? Mm-hmm. And for me, it's that issue of consent becomes so important. So in that case, if they're there, and even if they don't have a lot of choices because we're all constrained in various ways, then I wouldn't necessarily call it. I wouldn't feel, given what you said, suggesting it's paternalistic. I would say it may be more of an element, as you see, of partnership or collaboration. And I think there are instances of that. I've just seen them in the relief world a lot better about talking the game than actually acting it.
Just want to make a point. Can you imagine a government agency spending over a year arguing whether or not its main symbol, which was two hands clasping, should be two white males or should be a black male and a white male, or a woman's hand versus, I mean, there are very few government agencies that would go through that kind of angst to get the symbol right.
Is this right? I don't even know what.
USAID's symbol is two hands clasping. But the question,
are those supposed to be two white hands? It's been hard to tell.
This is
That's the point, Dr. Cooter.
Sorry.
This is a photo, but
I'll give them their money back.
In the case of the symbol, it was sort of an artist's conception of two hands clasping, but then the debate became, what are they? What kind of hands are they? Whose hands are they?
And why
hand models.
And why is the female hand in the back and the male's in the front?
Yeah, well, that's another.
Why is the background blue?
Well, I'm just trying to find a line of best fit here. I had your humanitarianism class 3 years ago, Dr. Barnett. I really enjoyed it. The consequentialist debate versus the direct aid. So I'm just thinking, the transformational approaches. William Easterly in his paper in both Can the West Save Africa talks about, the transformational approaches really don't work. I mean, he's disagreeing with the source that you cited in a large extent, that we ought to be looking at things that are, on the margins. The marginal approaches work better. Structural adjustment programs cause pain for years. I mean, they might at some points, cause enough pain that the currency is stabilized and something happens. But the Chinese might be teaching us a lesson in Africa, where they're coming in with capital, and we might disagree and say it's pretty awful they're buying farmland and they're buying lots of things from the Africans. But they're not coming in with this aid approach. They're coming in with an economic build approach that will not necessarily be a zero-sum game. And so what if microfinance on smaller scales can work with enough people who build in a certain community and they have enough economic power that expands outward? Governance continues to build from there because they're successful, there's an economic base to support these kinds of governance that are needed. And I realize that's, maybe even a pie-in-the-sky idealistic wish, but there are some things I think that Easterly says that kind of are a third way between Jimmy Kirkpatrick and, you know, maybe Nancy Pelosi's health bill, no offense, but.
Not to be too fine a point, maybe Jeffrey Sachs or something.
Right, so, I mean, is there something there? I mean, the marginal approach versus the transformational.
If the Chinese were able to articulate it, there might be something there.
Right.
But, I mean, they don't build local capacity while they're building roads and buildings and other things.
But can it happen because of that?
Oh, I think I think they're making a contribution. Infrastructure is an important aspect of development, but it would be better for them to build local capacity in building those things at least.
They're not wasting time arguing about paternalism.
No,
Right.
they're
And they're not
certainly
wasting
not.
any time with this because they assume paternalism everywhere.
They're
And
not
can we measure
conflicted.
empirically the local capacity?
And they have no
I mean, how
problem with it.
successful are we with that? I mean, we know it's an intellectual idea that we love to talk about and try to apply at the Hunger Institute and other public affairs schools, but what kind of empirical evidence does that actually support? That local capacity building is doing really good things, and it is in and of itself.
Well, one of the questions I've had empirically, I mean, I was actually, I want to get the reference, you know, is that there's a presumption that doing things locally is better. You know, and so part of what's going on is sort of local stakeholders, local knowledge, and so forth. And I've challenged when I was in Geneva, just to be even more, you know, I was also obnoxious in Geneva. I would run around and ask them to show me empirically where actually doing things locally led to a better outcome. And what was interesting was a lot of them couldn't show me. And not because it doesn't exist, but it was just sort of, it was interesting that was the assumption that, in fact, doing things locally is better. And there may be lots of reasons, I want to just know, that you might defend local participation, even if it doesn't lead to material gains, on the grounds of empowerment, sense of dignity, and, you know, a sense of doing things together, a kind of democratic spirit. So there may be lots of other reasons to value partnership that go beyond, you know, whether in fact it sort of, on the balance sheet it adds up. But I don't know, I guess, you know, part of me as you were talking began to get the other side that I get worried about, even though I've defended paternalism a bit, is I've always been worried about large government schemes. I've always, you know, I've been deeply influenced by people like James Scott and others in terms of, and what happens with bureaucracies and what happens with great public-minded, you know, so part of me, I mean, what this also reflects is a deep ambivalence I feel about all aspects of this relationship. And, you know, one of the things, again, I like about the concept of paternalism is that I haven't found a better concept that really does play out those tensions. I mean,
Did the European Union grow out of paternalism? I mean, we're already to the point now we may have a European president and we've got a new constitution. I mean, didn't that grow out of the Marshall Plan and the paternalism that existed at the time? Don't
Maybe
these
well,
things
if I would
evolve
be-
over time?
We do have an EU president, don't we? Yeah.
There is a position, they would name the person.
Right.
Right.
Well, folks, this has really been extremely provocative, and it's too bad that we have to end, but we do. And I know that if people have other questions or comments on Michael's work, he'd love to hear from you by email, or just stop by his office.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thanks to you, Michael.
Thank you. I really am sort of trying to get my head around this, so all these comments have been incredibly helpful, and if you have other thoughts, please pass them along.
And you'll give us your daughter's email addresses.
Yeah.
I'll do better.
Advice.
I'll give you my daughter's.
This was a sharp PowerPoint.
Yeah? Yeah.